Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about disaster recovery, and in particular, failing back to the primary cluster after a disaster. MemSQL is a distributed database, so we're not dependent on one single physical machine. We have aggregator nodes, and we have leaf nodes, and primary and secondary partitions. In a high availability cluster, we'll have all of these machines, and if any one machine goes down, the cluster can continue to run. But to increase high availability, we can create replication to a secondary cluster. Now in this case, the primary cluster here on the left replicates data to the secondary cluster here on the right. Now what happens if the primary cluster goes down? When the primary cluster is offline, replication stops, and the secondary cluster on the right becomes the primary cluster. This happens automatically. Now once the secondary cluster comes back online, the cluster on the left, we can set up replication from our new primary cluster on the right to the secondary cluster on the left, the one that was the primary cluster. When we're ready to fail back, we have a specific set of steps that we need to take to get the secondary cluster on the left to now be the primary cluster. So first, we stop writes on our new primary cluster here on the right. Second, we stop replicating data from the cluster on the right to the cluster on the left. Third, we promote that secondary cluster to be a primary cluster. Fourth, we set up replication from our new primary cluster on the left to our secondary cluster on the right. At this point, we've successfully failed back, and our primary cluster on the left is now replicating to our secondary cluster on the right again. So let's do a demo of this disaster recovery failback. Here we have one cluster on the left, our primary cluster. Here we have one cluster on the right, our secondary cluster. Let's set up replication. Let's simulate a failure scenario, and let's do DR Fail-back. First up, let's create a database. We'll use this database, and we'll fill it with some data. So now here in our primary database, we have 32 rows. Next up, let's set up replication. Here in our secondary database, we'll set up replication to our primary database. Notice that when we set up replication, we're just using the MemSQL ports. We don't need SSH access. Next, let's change some data in our primary database. We'll insert the value of -1. We can see in our secondary database that this data is already replicated into place. And we have all the rows in our secondary database. Next up, let's assume that our primary database, our cluster here on the left, is down. So let's stop replicating. Now our secondary database here on the right is our primary cluster. Let's insert some new data. We'll insert -2, -3, Okay, so now our cluster on the left is back up. Let's set up replication to go back the other way. We could do it the old way, which would require us to copy the entire database back into place. But instead, let's replicate database with force differential, only copying the changed rows. Now if we use our database, we can see that we have all of the rows, including all of the new rows that we entered into our database on the right. Now if we're happy here with our database on the right, serving all of the traffic, we can stop. But we really want this cluster on the left to be our primary cluster. So let's set that back up. Okay, so now we need to flush the tables with read-only. Writes are no longer allowed into this cluster on the right. Next, we're going to stop replicating once all of the change data is in place. Now we'll make some changes in our database. Let's delete all of the rows with a less than 0. We still have all of the old rows that should be deleted. Let's set up replication. And now as that data is replicated in, we can see that we no longer have that changed data in our database on the right. We were able to set up replication from our cluster on the left to our cluster on the right, and when the cluster on the left failed, we were able to recover gracefully, promoting our cluster on the right to be the primary cluster, and eventually failing back without having to copy all of the data, only the changed data into place. You can grab the scripts for these in the description below.